Rich Ross pointed out to me that I have one number up here and one number on your sheet. It is one and the same, but I'm a little out of sync this time of year. So we're going to go backwards in time a bit to the deposition from the cross and the Pietà before we get to the resurrection. Just a few words before we get into the images. We've studied, as you know, over these last 3 months, a lot about shepherds and the Good Shepherd, and how the Good Shepherd knows his sheep and calls them by name. This individualization of his sheep, that he knows us intimately, and we recognize his voice. And in today's reading, which was in John 20 and 21, we have a few more incidents of people being called by name in very special ways. The first is Mary Magdalene, who was, of course, the first at the tomb, and unusually, a woman gets to be there first and holds the place of honor. And she thinks that the ultimate outrage has been committed. Not only has her Lord been crucified, but she thinks that his body has been stolen. And she is in despair. She is weeping, and she turns to a man that she takes to be the gardener and says, "My Lord's body is gone. Have you taken it? Where has his body been laid?" And the man says to her, "Mary." And it's that voice that was so unmistakable that just sends a bolt through her, and she realizes that the gardener is in fact the Lord Jesus Christ, who has returned from the grave. She wants to hold him, she wants to embrace him, touch him, and he says, "You cannot cling to me. What I want you to do is go tell the others that I am risen." So she has a mission, and what a mission it is. The second person to be called by name is Peter, who also is in despair, in part because he has betrayed his Lord 3 times, denied 3 times that he ever knew him. So when Jesus is in company with Peter and the other disciples, 3 times he calls Peter's name, and 3 times allows Peter to say, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." So he is redeemed, and 3 times he is given the charge to feed my sheep. So each time a person is called, in a sense, by name, they are given a special mission to take the love of Christ, the care of Christ, and the hope of Christ to others. And I would suggest to you that that is the message of Easter for each of us. He knows each of us by name, and each of us has a special calling, whatever it might be, in our own way, to carry his love and hope forward. So we're going to see some of that today, but first we have to go through the sad events of the cross and the Pietà, the deposition and the Pietà. So I'll see if Jamie has the lights back there. I don't know if, I think they're, no, okay, I'll get these. I can do that. This is van der Weyden's most famous altarpiece. And what he's done here is to try to recreate what were the polychrome sculptured altarpieces of Northern Europe, often done in wood that was painted. He's given us the illusion of that in this kind of cross-like frame. And in fact, Jesus's body looks a bit like a crossbow. And in fact, it was the Greater Guild of Crossbowmen who commissioned this picture, this altarpiece. And just to show you what a crossbow looks like, there it is. And you can see that after it has been sprung, and in a metaphorical sense, Jesus has let the arrow go, his body has now released as a crossbow does. You'll notice also that there are actually 5 levels of depth in this, which is a complete contradiction, because the illusion would make this only kind of the width of one body. But you have Mary in the front, and perhaps Jesus at the same level, if not slightly behind. And then you have Nicodemus supporting Jesus' body. Then you have the cross. Then you have the ladder behind the cross. And then you have the servant here who has just taken the nails away from Jesus in order to let his body be removed from the cross. So a remarkable illusion in this very, very compressed space, what we would call a tableau vivant, a living picture. This is the illusion that is broken by the servant. There are a couple seats up here, and one over there, a couple there, I think. He breaks the illusion by putting his hand right through the frame. He's holding the nails, and if you can see it, it's right up here that he breaks the illusion. This altarpiece was a real eye-opener, not just for painters of the North, but especially for the painters of the South when they finally got wind of it, because of its naturalism. You can just about count every whisker on Jesus' face, every hair in his eyebrows. You see the wonderful beard of Nicodemus descending here, just beautifully done in oils, impossible with any other technique. Mary in a swoon, and this was one of the other reasons that this particular altarpiece was so unique. She had never been depicted as a mother fainting away beside her son, and in fact her body shape is the same as her son's. We'll see that again in a moment. These are the other two Marys, Mary Cleopas and Mary Salome, together with John, the disciple, weeping. And we move in, and you have to see the extraordinary use of oil to render these tears. Isn't that just incredible? The way you can use the transparent layers of oil with just a tiny amount of pigment in them to create this wonderful illusion of the reddened eyes and the tears streaming down. This is Mary Magdalene, and interestingly enough, as I focused in on this, I discovered that in this belt, which almost suggests a chastity belt, which is kind of appropriate for Mary Magdalene, who was reputed to be a rather loose woman before, she now has Jesus Maria imprinted on her belt, as if she were, in a sense, the bride of Christ, not in the Dan Brown sense, but in the sense of almost like a nun is married to Christ in a virginal marriage. And you see here how Mary's body echoes that of her son. The position of the arms is the same. She's supported in the same way by two other people. And in essence, this is just exactly the kind of devotional service that was being promoted at that time with Thomas à Kempis and so forth, the imitation of Christ. We are to be so identified with him in his suffering, in his love, that we take on his form in a sense, and that is what Mary has done here, in a sense, experiencing Jesus' death to the extent that she swoons and becomes deathly pale.
What is the skull?
Oop. That's to remind you that it's Golgotha, the foot of the cross, the place of the skull, and often you will see a skull at the foot of the cross. There's also a bit of a problem here, just to tease you a little bit. The ladder down here should be behind the cross, and yet you discover down here it's in front. And this was a problem for van der Weyden. He couldn't show it going any further back. So he kind of obscures it with this monumental robe of Mary's. But that's all he could do. He's already put 5 levels into this. So just a little addendum. Now to the Pietà. And I wanted to just call to your minds that a mother grieving her son is a universal theme. It's existed in all cultures. When a mother loses her son, it is unbelievable source of heartbreak. This is a Greek piece from the late Archaic period that I discovered at the Louvre. And it was off in a kind of a dusty corner. And I was so taken by it because it's such a prototype of our Christian Pietà that I ended up talking to a journalist friend of mine who talked to the head of the Louvre Museum School and encouraged them to put it in a place of honor, which they did. And it got a little light put on it, and I was so thrilled about that. So that's my tiny claim to fame. This is Eos, who was rosy-fingered Dawn of Homeric fame. Her son Memnon was killed in the Trojan War by Achilles. He was second only to Achilles in strength, but he was only half immortal because his father was mortal. And he was killed, and Eos comes to take his body. So a prototype of our own Pietà. This is a late Middle Ages Gothic Pietà that's also in the Louvre, one of their real masterpieces. It was the authorship, the person who painted it was in question for a long time. They finally decided it was Enguerrand-Carton or Charenton, French, and it's achingly painful to see Jesus' body so stiff, and the entire triangle of the composition is very solid, very heavy, weighted down with the two side figures, John the disciple, Mary Magdalene, both forming this arch over his body with the Mother Mary. John is removing the crown of thorns from Jesus' head in the most tender and eloquent way. It's as if those rays of light from Jesus were the strings of a musical instrument, and he is gently, gently holding Jesus' head as he takes away the crown of thorns. You see how Christ's body has suffered here from the flagellation. Above, it's been tooled into the gold leaf in Latin, this message: "You who pass by along the way, look and see if there is any grief such as mine." And that is Mary speaking to us about her son. It's not an uncommon thing for funeral monuments to bear a message for the passerby. And that's what is picked up here. This is the donor of the piece. This is the Pietà that you all know best. In the Vatican, in Rome, Michelangelo's very, very early piece. He felt it was the most beautiful piece of marble that he had ever worked with. And indeed, if you've ever seen it, it does seem alive. It feels as though you could touch the body of Jesus and that it would be warm almost. It was attacked a number of years ago by a crazed person, and as you can see, Mary's nose suffered damage, so that a block had to be taken from her back and smoothed into the tip of her nose to actually give it its own shape again. It's controversial in that Mary seems to be as young as her son, and Jesus doesn't seem to have suffered the indignities to which he was exposed. But Michelangelo wanted to render the kind of divine beauty of the Lord and what he felt to be the reflection of chastity of Mary. He felt that a woman who did not have any sexual relations would not age. And I suppose if we thought that were true, we'd probably stop reproducing. But it doesn't work that way. It's the only sculpture he signed, right across here, and that was not what he did at the beginning, but when it was on display, he heard several commentators giving credit to an artist by the name of Solari for having sculpted this, and this so infuriated him that he etched his own name into it, that Michelangelo Buonarroti made this. He regretted that burst of pride later, and he never again signed his name. So one of the most famous of Michelangelo's works. This I give to you because of what follows. Of course, it's a nativity scene, a scene of Christ's infancy, but it also foretells his suffering and death. There is a snake back here that the stork is attacking, but you see the raven up here, the bleakness on this side is a foretelling of what is to come. And I've always been very touched by this baby Jesus because my husband Jamie looks just like that when he sleeps. He does. It's true, I'm sorry. But I give it to you because the very same year Bellini painted this masterpiece, which is his own Pietà, very similar but also so different. Mary is much older, much more worn, very sad. You see the kind of path that her life and the life of Jesus has taken. You see a fig tree known by its leaves, but it's cut off because trees that bore no fruit, Jesus said, would be cut down. She's in her own verdant garden here, often the symbol of Mary, enclosed garden. So there you have the two, painted in the same year, but from very, very different perspectives. Both, however, with the monumental pyramidal construction that was so popular in the early Renaissance.
What are the cities in the background?
Usually, I mean, this could be taken as Jerusalem. Sometimes it's taken as the heavenly Jerusalem. The same would be true on this side, perhaps. There would be, one side would be contemporary Jerusalem or the city of Jesus' death. The other would be the heavenly Jerusalem to come. But it's also very typical, particularly here, of the Veneto, of the region around Venice that Bellini knew best. So it's Jerusalem transported to northern Italy. This is probably the most shocking of all of Mantegna's works and of all early Renaissance painting, partly because of the extraordinary foreshortening. We have Jesus' feet with their horrible wounds coming right out at us, and his hands where you can so vividly see the puncture wounds. And let's be frank, you also can see that he was a man. And this was not unusual at that time to show the genitals of Christ, particularly in baby scenes, because people wanted to underline the fact that he was indeed human, that he had maleness, that he was a real being. And we have his mother and either Mary Magdalene or John beside him mourning, and the jar of anointing oil for his body over there. So a shocking but incredibly wonderful picture in terms of its foreshortening and perspective, and that was one of Mantegna's very strong suits. This is Caravaggio. Once again, the chiaroscuro is used to great effect here, the light and darkness. You don't see anything in the background, just this cascade of light right down to the tomb. And it's a cascade of hands as well. From Mary Magdalene's gesture right down, it just tumbles down like a waterfall into the tomb, and we, the viewer, are at the base of the tomb. And just to add insult to injury, we see that the hand is actually in the wound in Jesus' side. But a much more naturalistic picture than anything you would see in the Northern School. Naturalism in an entirely different way from van der Weyden. And now the good news. This, as we've often begun, begins with Giotto in the Scrivegni Chapel. It's two scenes. It's the resurrection over here with the angels at the tomb and what is known technically as the noli me tangere, meaning don't touch me, which Jesus says, don't cling to me, don't keep hanging on to me. I am ascending to the Father. We're in a new relationship. And early on in the early 14th century, they did not show pictures of the resurrection with Jesus' body coming out because there wasn't scriptural evidence for that. The Bible does not describe precisely how Jesus got out of the tomb. And so they hesitated to depict it, but this scene is depicted again and again. His banner reads, Victor Mortis, the victor over death. This is one of my all-time favorite resurrection scenes. Aldous Huxley, in an essay, said that this was the greatest picture in the world. And there was an artillery officer who had read this essay. It was buried in the back of his mind. And he was asked when, during the course of World War II, he was stationed outside of San Sepolcro, the Holy Sepulchre, literally, which was Piero della Francesca's hometown. The word was out that the Germans were taking the town, and he was told to bombard the town. And it's then that he remembered San Sepolcro, that's where that famous painting is. So he disobeyed orders, and he didn't bombard the town. As it turns out, the Germans decided to retreat at that point, so it was spared, but today, I think there's even a street named after Tony Clark in San Sepolcro, Holy Sepulchre. It happens to be very dear to me for a very personal reason. When Jamie and I were living in London, I was in a study group, a Bible study group, with a woman by the name of Miranda. And she was very ill, prematurely so, but it was clear she was going to die. She kept coming to the study group, but periodically had to be hospitalized, a very rare disease that they could not treat. And in her last days, she was in the hospital all the time, and the church organized prayer vigils. She didn't want to be alone all the time, and so different ones of us signed up for different times. And I came in the first time, and I didn't know her that well, and she just said, Darcy, pray. So I prayed. And then we got to talking, and she said, if only I could just one more time see that picture. And I said, Miranda, what picture? She said, do you know that one where Christ is coming out of the tomb with a flag and his knee is just on top of the tomb and he's conquering death? And I said, I think I know the one you mean. Is it the Piero della Francesca? She said, yes. And so the next time I was able to bring in an art book with this picture, and she just held it almost as if it were the Bible. And I know from her family that it was by her side when she died. So it means a great deal to me, and you can see why she felt that she wanted to have her Lord pictured that way right beside her as she died, because it is the most powerful picture of Jesus conquering death. It's said also that this represents Piero himself, an autoportrait, because the flag comes right down, and he was said to have said that this indicates that he had a divine inspiration for this painting, which Jamie and I visited and sought it out in a rather remote town in Tuscany, and the guard in the Museo Civico, the civic museum that used to be just the town hall that Piero painted this for, he said that indeed that was Piero's intention, was to show that Jesus himself had kind of given him this idea, and that was his way of indicating it.
Question. I thought that the piercing of the side was to his heart.
No, it wasn't to his heart. It was said to be below, and whence came an issue of blood and water.
But it's on the other side here. It's on his right side. Your heart is on the left.
Well, but it wasn't his heart anyway. So there is a lot of license taken with these things. You're going to see a Bellini where there is no piercing whatsoever, but strict biblical accuracy in these. In fact, this is the one where there is no piercing at all. And Bellini's idea is to show that Jesus has overcome death in every way and his body has been restored. And indeed, if this is an altarpiece, but if it were an altarpiece of the crucifixion, it would be done in the same way. Jesus would be occupying that same place on the canvas, and it's a reversal of that in a sense. This is Jesus resurrected. You see, he is giving the blessing, and inadvertently, the soldier down here who carries a spear, as does this one, to pierce his side, he is inadvertently echoing that blessing. This was done right after, you remember Antonello that we looked at last week, who spread the gospel of oil painting to Italy. He was said to have brought it to Bellini, and it's used to masterful effect in this picture in the gradations of the heavens and of the rock formations. You need to see it in online to really see how wonderfully he's used that technique. And again, you have the sign of death here, but newness of life starting over here. Very, very famous early picture by Titian. It kind of divides the world in a sense. Jesus is in a new relationship to Mary. This is the noli me tangere, don't touch me, don't keep clinging to me. The tree almost separates him from her. His flock of sheep back here are visible. He is the good shepherd. This is a hoe, which is why she mistook him for a gardener. But they aren't that separated because you see the beautiful line of her body continues right up the tree, and the beautiful curve of his body crosses over into this village. So it's kind of a wonderful intersection of the two. The tree, unfortunately, has begun to change its color. It was all the same vivid green as down here, but there was a lot of copper material in his pigments which have begun to turn brown, and so they have changed color. This, together with all of the great pictures that were in the National Gallery and the other museums in London, were spirited away before the Germans could destroy them. They were taken to the Welsh countryside and secured away in hidden places. But as the bombardment, as the Blitz went on and the population of London became more and more depressed about how the war was going, it was decided that one picture a month would be brought out and used to create some optimism and hope in the hearts of the Londoners. So there was a campaign in the London Times to find out which picture was the one they most wanted to see. And this is the one that won their hearts, and it's the first one that was shown, and one a month afterward. Neil MacGregor, who was the head of the National Gallery, now the head of the British Museum, when he was asked why it was that they chose this, he said, as far as he was concerned, it's probably because it represented the kind of hope of love eternal that was Titian's message in this, that they needed to know that there was a love that outlasted death. And so we have Titian's wonderful picture. If Mary could not touch Jesus, here Thomas is really getting his finger in it. Two entirely different messages. Now biblically this is not recorded. We just know that Jesus said, okay, Thomas, you were the doubter. Now just stick your finger into my side if you want to feel my wounds. It doesn't say he did it, but Caravaggio uses a little poetic license to have Jesus just pulling the linen aside and letting Thomas peek in as the other disciples peer on. Rather wonderful, very tactile image. This is how Titian creates a sculptural work. We saw how van der Weyden did by imitating the polychrome altarpieces that had existed before. Here, taking a look at this one I've outlined of, this is St. Sebastian, and he's clearly borrowed from Michelangelo. That twisting body and the heavy musculature is very reminiscent of sculpture. And for Christ's own body, he took a leaf out of a page from the Hellenistic world, which Michelangelo was also inspired by. This was unearthed in 1506 and had a huge effect. It was literally taken out of the ground, and they saw how the human body was depicted in ancient times. And so you have a very powerful, strong Christ whose pose kind of imitates Laocoon, who was the Trojan priest who was killed by sea serpents with his 2 sons. And a dawning scene because the resurrection occurred at dawn. So a very, very powerful, triumphant Christ. Michelangelo, obviously not just sticking to sculpture, but creating wonderful visions. He was asked by the Medici family to decorate, to paint the above the tomb of the Medici family in San Lorenzo, and there were many designs for it. I'd like you just to take a look at this one as well, also designed for the tomb. He thought about this for a long time, but the two are although similar, very, very different. This one, if you can actually see it online or face to face, the musculature is much more outlined in the interior of the body. Even every bone in the knee, all the muscles of the quadriceps are outlined. Here it's a much more visionary image. Not only is he going up, but it's the outside of his body that receives all of the emphasis. So it takes him up and out of the picture. So in this one, Jesus is looking down. We don't see it, but this would have been the flag that we had Piero holding. But here, it's Jesus soaring out of the tomb and just blowing the guards away. Another one, this is created for the lunette, it's thought, of the Medici tomb. And you can see in the shape, the form of this, that it probably was a design for that. Again, very earthy, very thickly muscled Christ in this one. Aspirational, yes, but very rooted to the ground. This, again, for the Medici family, is going to remind you of something else. If you flip it around, and you can see how Michelangelo experimented with different positions for the legs. He wasn't certain what he wanted to do. If you turn it this way, then you're reminded of his image of the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel that comes just a few years later, because Michelangelo doesn't waste a thing. Yes, he's going to do the Medici tomb, but it's not just going to be for that. He doesn't always have to reinvent himself. He can use a pose that he likes in the Sistine Chapel as well. This is his last resurrection image that I can show you, perhaps his most finished, a really beautiful one, probably a presentation piece. Veronese imitating Titian. We talked about a good artist borrows and a great artist steals. Well, Veronese clearly stole from Titian, but a very different kind of rendering, because you see what he does with the foreground. He fills it with characters and different levels to take your eye back. Whereas here the emphasis is on darkness, the sheen of metal on this soldier, but really emphasizing the dawn. And here there's no particular idea of dawn. It's just Jesus' power forcing the men to fall back as he soars out of the tomb. Similar for Tintoretto. He explodes out of the tomb. 4 angels are taking away the stone, and the light just is brilliant behind Jesus as he conquers death. The women are seen approaching here right afterward. This is where El Greco's style works to the greatest effect, I think. You know, he likes those elongated forms that seem like flames. And with Jesus coming up out of the tomb and these wonderfully foreshortened soldiers falling back with these almost emaciated bodies, it just is really a transcendent image. I think it's one of his greatest works for my money. Wonderful foreshortening here, and the limbs just going upward like flames. I forgot to put this in your sheet. This is one of Raphael's cartoons for a series of tapestries that are in the Vatican Museum. But the tapestries are. The cartoons are in the Victoria and Albert Museum. This is Jesus speaking to Peter, calling him by name 3 times, saying, "Do you love me? Feed my sheep." And these are, obviously, he didn't mean literally feed sheep, but that's how Raphael gets that message across. They're huge drawings, by the way, huge. They're called cartoons, meaning simply a pattern, which was to be used for the making of a tapestry. Just a few from the Northern School, 3 images of the life of Mary with Jesus as a baby, and she's in white for her virginity. Here she's in red for the Passion, blue, shortly she will become the Queen of Heaven. There's a crown up above each because she will be the Queen of Heaven. Each of these is a scene from the Old and the New Testament, highly detailed. But we're going to look more closely at the resurrection scene because it's a scene that is very seldom depicted. It's not biblical. It's Jesus appearing first of all to his mother before anybody else to tell her that he is alive. And you see, it shows him resurrected in the background with the angels, the women led by Mary Magdalene in her red. She's always in red. But first of all, he comes and he takes the path up here to visit his mother. Extra biblical, outside of the Bible, but it became one of the sort of legends that accrued around the resurrection. This is the altarpiece that you saw last week when we looked at the crucifixion. It's in Colmar, right outside of Colmar, in Alsace. And on the other side of this is the Annunciation scene that we saw at the very beginning of our time together, and the Nativity scene, but this incredible hallucinogenic resurrection scene. There is just nothing like this in the world of art. And one of the reasons it's thought that it is so hallucinogenic is because Grünewald was painting it for this hospital where the patients suffered from ergotism, this disease that was spread by improperly fermented grain. And the patients themselves, in addition to suffering the wounding of the body, terrible sores, they also had visions. They had hallucinogenic visions, and it's thought that Grünewald either suffered from it or was told about it by the patients. And so in sympathy with them and in empathizing with them, he creates this wonderfully just out of sight Christ, and from his wounds, wonderfully, the light is pouring. The wound in his side, and if you see it in person, which is definitely worth it if you happen to be in that part of the world, it's even more dramatic and much bigger in person. The stars behind him in this rainbow image, wonderful colors of his robes, every color of the rainbow. And I thought that that would be a great piece to leave you with on Easter, just this wonderful image of the resurrection. And so I thank you for being with me these 3 months. I thank Tom Winter for doing an incredible job of filming this so you can enjoy it later. And I thank the Cederbergs for having the imagination to let me do this and encourage me to do it. Thank you, St. Mary's.